Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti alla casa italiana zerilli-marimò della New York University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. My name is Stefano Albertini, I'm the director of the casa. And we have 2 days, today and tomorrow, with something that is particularly dear to me. And it's a proposal that came to us from Italy, from the Ventotene Film Festival. And it's 2 days of films and documentaries focusing on a fundamental moment in the history of Italy and Europe. That is the Ventotene Manifesto. In the small island of Ventotene during World War II, 3 internal political exiles, Altiero Spinelli, Ernesto Rossi, and Eugenio Colorni, came up with this manifesto. It was a manifesto that, despite the destruction and the devastation brought about by World War II and by the madness of totalitarianism, seemed to express hope in the future of nations. And it was a hope in a future of tolerance, dialogue, and peace. That's why I wanted very strongly to have these 2 days. And the Manifesto di Ventotene is considered also one of the founding documents of the European Union. And in the light of what happened this past summer with Brexit and the growing indifference, if not hostility, on part of many people in Europe against the European Union, I think it is very important to look back at the reasons why the European Union was formed. Probably some of you will think that these 3 great men were somehow idealistic, and they probably were. But I think that without men like them, with their idealism included, the world would be a much, much sadder place. So I'm delighted that we have a chance to find out about them, to discover more of their story, and also to open up to the present. Tonight's program, and I'm going to be very brief before I give the floor to Loredana Commonara, it's made of 2 major parts. The first part is a documentary in Italian with English subtitles called L'Europa, prima dell'Europa, Europe before Europe, and talks exactly about this Ventotene Manifesto. The second, that's going to begin more or less around 7, is called Il mio nome è Adi. And it's the story of a young Moroccan boy, 13 years old, that is reunited with his father in Milan. And some of you might wonder, what does that have to do with the beginning of the European Union or with an idea of a unified Europe? And I believe that has everything to do with an idea of a unified Europe and with the founding values that brought people like Spinelli, Colorni, and Rossi to their conclusions in the manifesto. As you know, there is a major crisis in Europe. It's an immigration crisis. There is a film actually running at IFC called Fuoco a Mare by Gianfranco Rosi. It takes place in another island, the island of Lampedusa, where thousands of people come from the shores of Africa to try to come from the shores of Africa to Europe. And it's a crisis in which Europe didn't give the best of itself. And it's only now that it's slowly starting to confront the problem and trying to have a common project for political refugees and other people that are trying to escape wars, famine, and other calamities. So my name is Adi is not about the founding of the European Union, but it's definitely about the values that brought the European Union together. And without further ado, I would like to, first of all, welcome Mr. William Pace, who is the Executive Director of the World Federalist Movement, and to give the floor to Loredana Commonara, who is the Director of the Ventotene Film Festival. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for you being here tonight. I would like to thank Stefano Albertini to hosting us. The aim of Italy on Screen today is to promote Italian cinema through a series of movies. within this festival, we dedicate an homage to Altiero Spinelli, but Stefano told everything about Altiero Spinelli. So, an homage to one of the founding fathers of the United Europe. And after the documentary Europe Before Europe, we will screen My Name is Adil, that is some way talks about the new Europe. I would like also to invite you on Friday, 28th of October. We will screen beautiful movie on Shin Center in Bleecker Street, 18 Bleecker Street, and we will have a special guest, main actress of the movie, Paola Cortellesi. She's an acclaimed Italian, very famous Italian actress. So if you would like to come, you are welcome to us. Now I would like to introduce William Pace, is the director of World Federalist movement. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for my English.
Well, thank you. There's a relationship between the peace movement that I have the great honor to be its general secretary, the World Federalist movement, and Spinelli and the Manifesto. But there's also a very great connection with Ventotene. We have our governing body meetings in Ventotene on many instances over the last 30 years, and it's an incredibly beautiful island if you've never had the enjoyment of traveling to Ventotene. This manifesto and the influence of Spinelli and his friends and their wives illustrates some very important points I would like to make this afternoon. My organization was formed in 1947 in a series of meetings, mostly in Europe. In fact, at the time that the International World Federalist Movement was formed, the European Federalist Movement was formed. We had been within 20 years seen two of the most, and really the most devastating, destructive, murderous wars in all of history. The founders and intellectual founders of our movement, like Spinelli, like Albert Einstein, believed that the human race had only 10 or 15 years to be able to find the mechanisms for the international community to prevent World War III. As you may know already, within 2 years after the end of World War II in 1945, in October, or in August of 1945, within 2 years, already the relationships between the United States, Western Europe, and the Soviet Union had become extremely contentious, and basically an occupation of what we think of now as Eastern Europe had occurred on a systematic and extremely repressive basis, and we sank into this Cold War, which also was characterized by this massive military buildup in the West and in the East, and the new weapons of mass destruction. Already at the early part of World War I in 1914 and 1915, Einstein and others were talking that the main cause of the wars was imperialism and extreme nationalism, and that the only real solution was the political and economic integration in Europe. Obviously, the solution of the Versailles Treaty was so disastrous that it in fact inflamed the kind of fascism and Nazism that arose in Europe and led to World War II beginning in the late 1930s. Spinelli was already imprisoned with his colleagues for years at that point, in prison and detained for 16, 17 years. So it was he was someone who was making a tremendous sacrifice. And the Ventotene and Spinelli, the manifesto, is a great statement that became an outline for great leaders that occurred in Europe in the late 1940s and 1950s and 60s and 70s. And you did see finally the slow integration of Europe, and in 1984, Spinelli, as a European Parliament, already that there had been a creation of a Parliament for Europe, and he was one of the first parliamentarians, and introduced a law that the European Parliament adopted that really became the background document for the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, which is really the formation of the modern Europe. This race we are in between federalism and the rule of law and catastrophe of human annihilation, we're now in our 70th year. But I think it is no understatement to argue that what we have seen in the development of the European Union, even as all of its weaknesses and defaults and mistakes and the problems of the most recent years, that it is the greatest development of international democracy in all of human history. In fact, it's the most clear example of international democracy, where over 500 million people on 27, 28 countries are integrated by a federalist international laws and treaties. And you did see throughout the first 15 and 20 years after the end of the Cold War that this impact was happening all over the planet. The African Union, after the Rwanda genocide and after the 40 or 50 years in which the transfer of power in Africa always occurred through coups d'etats and military takeovers, the Organization of African Unity was transformed into the African Union, and the African Union was taking many steps, especially during the extraordinary period of leadership of Nelson Mandela from 1995 to 2005 to become a European Union-like federative organization for Africa. We saw the same developments in the organization for the American states on this continent, and we've seen similar developments in ASEAN, in sub-regional organizations in 2 or 3 places in Africa, in the Mercosur and other, now an effort to create a kind of a United States of South America that have been developing. And of course, we've now seen in the last 5 and 10 years steps backwards from political and economic integration. We have tremendous, in fact, in the United States, the term federalism was taken over by an extremist political groups, law students, the Federalist Society, to the extent that our U.S. groups had to change their name because they were being misrepresented. So federalism here has become anti-federalism in a sense. You've seen with Brexit the withdrawal that you're inside of the European Union, which immediately was recognized for the catastrophe that it is, and it's going to be unfolding now for several years. And we're seeing withdrawal pressures. One of our biggest projects as a peace movement has been the development of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, which has now 124 nation states that have governments that have ratified the treaty, but now we're seeing African leaders who do not want to be held accountable to an international court for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, beginning to withdraw and making outrageous lies and claims. And of course, the election in the United States is such a catastrophe of democracy that it is, we're living in very, very difficult times. But it is a time to also then to remember the heroes of the progress of humanity and the progress of the rule of law and in international affairs. And the manifesto and the story of Spinelli and the efforts to create the European Union is one of the great stories of history. If the human race survives, and it's still a very questionable issue with the weapons of mass destruction and the kind of violent terrorism that is sometimes non-state, but also many times state-generated. We are still in very dangerous times on this planet. But if we survive this period of the creation of the European Union, of the creation of international constitutional democracy, will be seen as finally the path in which the human race was able to address the plague spot of civilization, the institution of war. And I'll finish that our challenge as a human race remains the same as it did in late August of 1945, because as you recall, that war ended with the United States government dropping atomic bombs on Japanese cities. The human race has to find ways to make peace with itself, with each other. We have to make peace with the rest of life on this planet. We have to make peace with the planet. The constitutional democratic federalism, which was begun with this European Union process after World War II, is the best hope humanity has, and for that matter, the rest of life and the integrity of our planet. So I'm very honored to be invited to do this introduction. What these individuals did, and that's another message from this story, is that individuals can make a huge difference, and their ability to tell the story, as we're looking forward to seeing this documentary this afternoon. Telling the story can make a huge difference. And so while there are very difficult and challenging times and stormy times ahead of us, I think the Spinellis, the manifestos, these are guiding lights for us, and I hope you will join me in welcoming this important documentary. Thank you very much.